O título desse painel é Dinâmicas da violência no norte de Moçambique. O meu nome é Paolo, sou do Departamento de História da Universidade do Cabo Ocidental, em Cape Town. Então, temos, infelizmente, uma das apresentações do painel, a última, do João Pereira e Salvador Forquilha, foi cancelada e vai ser mexida num outro painel. Então temos três apresentadores. Vou apresentar em pormenores os apresentadores quando for o turno dele, mas temos o Joseph Hanlon, a Signe Arnfred e a Giulia Barletta conosco. Então cada um vai ter 15 minutos para a sua apresentação. Vou ser um pouco mau para todos terem o tempo depois para termos o tempo para debate e questões. Então, o primeiro apresentador é o Joseph Hanlon, Joe Hanlon. Acho que nem precisaria de apresentação. Ele é Senior Fellow no Departamento de Estudos Internacionais na London School of Economics. Tem, agora não sei exatamente, mas deve ter 40 ou mais anos em Moçambique. Autor de muitos livros sobre a política, história política, sobre o desenvolvimento. Autor de um boletim sobre Moçambique que serve de fonte de informação para muitos de nós sobre os acontecimentos do país e tem sido bastante envolvido na discussão, no debate sobre a guerra Cabo Delgado nos últimos anos. Então, o título do professor Hanlon é How the IMF and its allies created Mozambican oligarchs leading to the Cabo Delgado resource curse and civil war.
Thank you very much for waiting for things about which we have no control. I want to look back 30 years at how the post-Cold War period created changes to Mozambique's economy to create a rentier and comprador economy. Now, many people would say that the Cabo Delgado resource curse and the war can be blamed in part on poor governance and the greed of the Frelimo nomenclatura. That nomenclatura profits from its political control of minerals and other assets and gains rents by providing those assets to foreign capital. That is a rentier and comprador capitalism, which does not promote development. But what I want to argue here is that this was a system which was created. This was intentional. At the end of the Cold War, in the era of neoliberalism and greed is good, the IMF and the international community reshaped Mozambique to have that economy. And we really need to go back even 70 years to see how much Mozambique was shaped by the Cold War. In the 1950s and the 1960s, the US and NATO backed fascist Portugal in trying to prevent colonial independence. This in turn forced the independence movements to look to the other side of the Cold War, the socialist countries and movements for support. Eventually, Frelimo won its independence. But in the 1980s, the US President Ronald Reagan intensified the Cold War. He labeled Mozambique as communist, and he said we're going to back the anti-communist movements and anti-communist countries such as apartheid South Africa. And he created something called proxy wars. Many of us forget proxy wars now, but this was a way to avoid nuclear war between the two sides in the Cold War by fighting small wars in third countries. Mozambique, Angola, Nicaragua, they were fought by local people, but they were still East-West wars. And the United States used apartheid South Africa to build and to support Renamo. In Mozambique, the war in the 1980s killed 1 million people, and the economy was devastated. Of course, at the end of the Cold War, the United States, the IMF, and the World Bank were very generous, and they offered to rebuild Mozambique, or help to rebuild. But there was a condition. The condition was that Mozambique accepted the policy of shock therapy that was being imposed on the countries of the former Soviet Union. Mozambique was the only country in Africa where shock therapy was imposed. And the idea of shock therapy was a quick transition to the market economy, variously called the Big Bang or shock therapy. And the issue here is quick. It's to quickly turn the communists into capitalists. But there's no time to create a new capitalist class. So what you do instead is you take the people who have party power in the socialist countries and who have party power over assets, and you quickly turn them into capitalists, using those assets that they already have control of. And this was what we now call oligarchs in Russia, but also in Mozambique. All right, Mozambique only has baby oligarchs, but nonetheless they're oligarchs. And there were two countries that was able to reject shock therapy, China and Vietnam. And they did a step-by-step transition to the market, which, as we know, was very successful. Now, there is, over the late 1970s and 1980s, a general discussion in the centrally planned economies about the need to move toward the market. And it really started in the late 1970s with Samora Machel, who did his famous speech in which he said the state does not sell needles, that small businesses should be given back to the private sector. And the war, of course, was going on in the 1980s. The economy was being very damaged. But in the late 1980s, Mozambique tried a step-by-step process. This was the PREI, the Programa de Reabilitação Econômica, which was an attempt to do a step-by-step move to the market. Now, it was hugely successful in its way. Despite the war, GDP actually went up in Mozambique in that period with this step-by-step move to the market. Now, the problem was that this had some support of the World Bank because the World Bank was promoting privatization at that time, and that privatization was a huge part of that package. Now, there was a battle within the Bretton Woods institutions, and in the late 1980s, the World Bank was dominant in Mozambique. But in 1990, the IMF won the battle and took control in Mozambique over the World Bank. And they did two things. They not only said no step-by-step, only do shock therapy, but they also imposed austerity, which was part of the package. And from 1990 to 1995, the minimum wage was halved from $30 to $15 per month. By 1995, 2/3 of civil servants were below the absolute poverty line. They couldn't buy enough food. Well, of course, the international community recognized that this was happening, so the donors stepped in, and part of shock therapy, of course, is that you're bringing over people to the international community. So what the donors looked at was at the squeezed middle class, and they were given jobs in embassies, there were paid conferences, there were consultancies, and there were especially top-ups for people in government who followed the new line, the new liberal line. Of course, if you opposed the new line, you didn't get your top-ups or your consultancies. And aid was increasing at that point, and of course, that meant more contracts, which were going to the oligarchs. One of the things that was important in shock therapy is the need to smooth money flowing out of all of the countries that had shock therapy imposed. Because part of the point of shock therapy is to take large amounts of money. Hundreds of billions of dollars were taken out of Russia, for instance. Now, what you needed to do that was to make sure that the banks were not controlled domestically. The banks had to be controlled internationally in order to smooth that transfer of money. So in Mozambique, the bank and the fund were involved in 3 different banks. The World Bank actually helped to set up BIM, Banco Internacional, and the IMF and the World Bank both forced the corrupt privatizations of BCM and BPD. BPD was the People's Development Bank. And what is interesting is, writing about it at the time, the IMF officials and World Bank officials knew that the only privatizations were going to be corrupt. And they said openly, we would rather have banks in control of corrupt foreigners than Mozambicans. All 3 of the banks that the Bretton Woods institutions were involved in failed. They had massive debts, obvious fraud, money laundering, and huge amounts of money lending by the directors to themselves and friends. But more to the point, they had murder. The BIM managing director, Lima Felix, was assassinated in 1997, journalist Carlos Cardozo in 2000, and the chair of BPD, by then renamed Banco Austral, Antonio Siba Mapwapwa, on the 11th of August 2001. And some of you will know the bank building down on the Baixa and in Cinco de Setembro, tall bank building. Siba was thrown from the top of the building down the stairwell. And if you look at the forensic investigation, there is blood and skin that goes down every level of the 15-story building. This was a nasty assassination. Yet there was no action against the managers who acted illegally or the oligarchs who stole money, and there was no action against the murderers of Siba and Lima Felix. 2 months after the murder of Siba was the Donor Consultative Group meeting in October of 2001. Mozambique had asked for $600 million in aid and was given $722 million. Sergio Vieira, a former security minister, said Mozambique was getting more money than it asked for showing that the international community had decided, quote, the good performance of the government overrides the bank scandal and the assassinations of Siba and Carlos Cardozo. In other words, the international community was rewarding Mozambique for murders in the bank scandals. Now, one of the things we have to remember is that in the colonial period, Mozambicans were not allowed to be business people for the most part, had very little management experience in the colonial period. In the post-colonial period, that very brief post-colonial period, there was you had to keep things running. And so you're teaching Mozambique about capitalism. And there were 5 lessons that were taught. First, that capitalism is not about production or profit and loss. Instead, it's the state and the World Bank provides everything. Free companies and money, contracts, everything. The second is that for the elite that's subservient, money comes from abroad, and especially the donors. Lesson 3 is that oligarchs have impunity. and can kill and steal in the name of the free market. Oligarchs can keep money abroad, as we'll show in the next slide. Meanwhile, below that, the free market means nothing is free. Nurses, teachers have to demand bribes to survive, but we call them fees. Finally, Mozambique found resources. The first big resource was Tet coal. President Joaquim Chissano personally negotiated with Vale to open the mine in Tet. The contract was signed in 2007, and was coming in that period. There's a signing fee of $120 million, which should go to the government of Mozambique. Because the IMF at that point was controlling how much money Mozambique can spend on development. And so it said that money couldn't come into Mozambique. So the IMF decided that Joaquim Chissano could set up a bank account in a New York bank, and that money would be put into that bank that he controlled. Now, you might have thought that was corrupt, but no longer. This was cooked up by the IMF. Cabo Delgado, of course, became the main resource area, is now the resource coast. Remember, Pashinwapa becomes kind of a key figure here. He was an independence veteran. He's still a member of the political commission. He heard that there were rubies found by artisanal miners. He grabbed 35,000 hectares, evicted all of the people on the site. And as part of the oligarch model, of course, he can't run a ruby mine, so he sells 3/4 of it to Gemfields, which runs it. In 2010, we have the third largest gas field in Africa, found offshore. About 2,500 people were displaced and lose their livelihoods. And that takes us on to the war. Cabo Delgado is amongst the most deprived and marginalized provinces. And there was no trickle down from the gas and the rubies. And some people rebelled. The first shots were fired in the Sumbo de Praia on the 5th of October 2017 in the start of the new civil war. And what's interesting is that people from both sets of evictions, Gemfields and Afungi, became insurgents, as well as a lot of other people. The war has expanded to half of Cabo Delgado and now into Nampula province. More than 4,000 people have been killed, nearly 1 million people have been displaced. Total Energies declared force majeure. The war continues, and nearly all the work on the gas has stopped. Just this year, people are beginning to notice that perhaps something is wrong. The World Bank, in its very recent report, said Mozambique's decade-long remarkable growth performance makes it one of the fastest-growing countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but is now amongst the most equal, and that only the top people benefit. President Nyusi, just last month, looked back to 1990 and admitted the costs. Economic liberalization and the adoption of the market economy has led some people to forget the main interest of defending the party and the people. Okay, I've been calling this a resource coast, but for an awful lot of people it's not a resource coast. For some local oligarchs, money from rubies, from other minerals, timber, drugs, as well as their cut of the humanitarian aid and the rebuilding means that for them, it's not a resource coast at all. The IMF and World Bank shock therapy of 35 years ago has proved a success. The oligarchs and foreign companies control the wealth and profit from a rentier and comprador economy. But there's no gain for the local people, who become poorer, more angry, and back a war that has stopped the gas project. Finally, 30 years late, the World Bank and President Nyusi are perhaps recognizing the cost of shock therapy. Can the oligarchs and the foreign gas and mining companies be convinced of the need to share some of the wealth, or is it too late? Thank you.
Muito obrigado. A próxima intervenção é pela professora Signe Arnfred, que é socióloga, antropóloga, estudiosa de gênero, professora na Universidade de Roskilde, também tem muitos anos a trabalhar sobre Moçambique e tem publicado vários livros, um especificamente sobre a sexualidade e as políticas de gênero em Moçambique e outros sobre sexualidades e gênero em África mais em geral. Então, a sua intervenção de hoje, ela também vai falar em inglês, está intitulada From the Previous to the Present War, Reflections Based on Fieldwork in Northern Mozambique over 3 decades.
Eu sou Signe Arnfred. A minha linha de investigação é muito diferente. I'm a gender scholar and I worked in the OMM when I was living in Maputo in the 80s, and they sent me to Cabo Delgado in order to investigate what had happened to the women during the war, and this research has determined whatever I have been doing since then, because I found out that my ideas of gender did not fit the situation in Cabo Delgado. So this is about a very different aspect of the present situation, and I will focus on Joe focus on economy and politics, and I will focus on the invisible worlds, because this was what I learned from the women, and my knowledge is from women, talking to women like this one, who is from Cabo Delgado. When I came back to Mozambique as an independent researcher with money from Denmark, I come from Denmark, I chose to focus on Nampula because of the Makua being the most full-fledged matrilineal society in Mozambique. But my initial research was in Cabo Delgado, and I have been quite familiar with things in Cabo Delgado. What I'll talk about here is first, as I said to you, we are going to the invisible world, about the importance of the curandeiros and curandeiras. I'll talk about the importance of the matrilineal kinship system and the double female chieftainship, and I will talk about the Sufi Islam of the coast. I'm not a scholar of Islam, but I have noticed, and this is what I'll talk about, how Islam, the Sufi Islam, has been very adaptable to the invisible world in very different ways than the newer versions of Wahhabi Islam and the present ideas, which are much more fundamentalist. This is the section about the curandeiros. When after the war had finished, I could go to the north and do my studies in Nampula, and I went to Ribaue in interior Nampula. Well, I should have, never mind, you know where it is. It is not at the coast. I did studies in the interior with Ribaue, sort of 120 kilometers west of Nampula city, and then I did something on the coast. In Ribaue, there had been a lot of devastation of the war. You see here the ruins. When I came to Ribaue, the Palacio do Governo, the Governador was a ruin, and there were ruins everywhere. But the interesting thing was that people had healed because of the curandeiros. There were not people from both sides could drink on Fridays, they could talk, they could live together because of they had been healed in the processes run by the male and female curandeiros, which I think is very important. And I have more pictures of Ribaue ruins with a very characteristic Nampula Inselbergen back. And I think this quote, which I put in blue by Caroline Nordstrom, is very important to keep in mind. She says that few have documented the sophisticated countrywide peace-building system these people, the curandeiros, forced day by day from the ground up. Yet without these people's work, the peace accord that was finally reached in 1992 would never have been possible. And she is totally right. I think it's so important to investigate what goes on in daily life among people. And this is often not on the agenda. And the reason it's not on the agenda, I didn't make a slide on this, that is because in the epistemological conceptions of the world and of gender, there's very great similarity between colonialism, Frelimo, and the development world. They all have a modernist kind of outlook, and they have to, I think it's very necessary to sort of destabilize that in order to find out what is actually going on beneath the surface. Here we have, I also went to Angos, and there are lots of curanderos. If any of you are researchers here, go to Angos and find out, because I chose to focus on Mozambique Island, because Angos was too big a mouthful even for me as an anthropologist, because of the plenty of curanderos, because here curanderismo is mixed up with Islam, and it's all very complicated. So I went to, this is just some nice pictures from Ilya. I want to tell you first more about Ribaue, because there's a double chieftainship which works to this day. There's a male chief, who is the one that people sort of refer to, and then there's in this part of Nampula is called the Mwene, and then he has a female counterpart, the pure Mwene. She has been there all along, but she doesn't meet the strangers. This is my very first impression of Mozambique from a visit in a solidarity group in '89. And we came and we saw the man in the trousers and shoes. He was the chief, and we talked to him as a delegation from Denmark. It's only because I took his photograph, it's only afterwards that I noticed the women in the back. They didn't speak Portuguese, and we didn't talk to them, but they are actually the important women of the place here, and including the Piamwene. So neither colonial power nor Mozambique nor development ever saw this female power. And I think, things are going on that is beyond the gaze of the modernity paradigm, as I call it here. The Piamwene, maybe I should, how long time have I got? Well, I'll just read through this, because this is, so they have remained unseen by all these powers, whichever kind they were, and they have the communication with the ancestors. They pour this makeya, it's called in this part of Nampula, which is sorghum flour. You put it on particular places, and it has to be done by the Piamwene, and they also have ceremonies of rain, etc. And then the important point is all the changes in Mozambique's history over the last 100 years hasn't changed. It's only, and in Nampula, the power of the Piamwene, the inland Nampula, is still intact, and it's important to take that into consideration. Now we come into the last part that is about the coast and is about Islam. And what I discovered was that Islam, patriarchal as it is, was also strongly influenced by the Makua system of double-gendered power. So in the leadership of the brotherhood, you have a man and you have a woman. The Halifa, which is just second in command, but here she is always a woman, and women have their own places of worship. This is the major mosque, so it's not a picture of one of the women's mosques. But I studied particularly the Tufu dance, and that was because it is very picturesque. I suppose many of you here, being Mozambicans, have seen Tufu dancing and know what this is. It's all over the coast, but I was very impressed by the organization of the Tufu groups. They had networks going all over the coast. They had gatherings of 3,000 people at points, and so the women learned a lot in this way, organizational skill, and also, of course, the dancing skills. And very often the songs at that point, when I did this investigation in the 90s, were very political. I don't have time to read this whole Tufu song, but it is Tufu. Ilya de Mozambique always felt marginalized by Frelimo. I suppose you know this, because Frelimo saw that Islam had been accepted by colonial power and corrupted by colonial power. So Frelimo in the beginning didn't want to touch Islam, and the people of Ilya, of course, was offended by this. So they were very fed up with Islam. And this song is about the bad maintenance of Ilya, the bad maintenance of the hospital, how people must feel ashamed. And for Ilya, this was a disgrace, and they were, all Ilyois are very sort of patriotic about Ilya de Moçambique. So it's not because political conscience isn't there, it's just expressing itself in unexpected ways. And here are more Tufu groups. Tufu are also very inventive. They invent new. This is the Estrella Vermelha group, the one in the red, and they all have their particular colors. And there's a long story about the Estrella Vermelha group who tried to be sort of buy into Frelimo rhetoric, but without being really Frelimo in their minds. Oh, this is a long. I'm not going to read all this. I don't have time. I end up with a picture of the book, things I read, so you can read it there. But there's a lot of history of Islam on the coast, and there's a lot of what I found. I'll just do that. I think what I found that actually Ilya has been full of. It was, I mean, part of the slave economy, and if you go higher up on the Swahili coast, you find very strong traces of enslaved people having turned kind of. Not now enslaved anymore, but it's still in the social hierarchy. In Ilya, there is no Islamic social hierarchy and no old-time social hierarchy. So I think it's important to see this different development, and very much, in my interpretation, very much due to this mixed with matrilineal, which is also with its gender balance system, is also always a very egalitarian society. So I'm just pointing to lots of understudied areas in the north of Mozambique, which are also important and interesting in this war, and these are for your reference. My book, which I made of all my investigation in 2011, with this night picture of women from Ilha de Moçambique, and then an article which is also about Islam. So that's the end.
Obrigado por esta intervenção. Então vamos para a terceira e última interveniente. A Barletta, Giulia é mestre em desenvolvimento global pela Universidade de Copenhagen e atualmente assistente de pesquisa no Development Economic Research Group na mesma universidade. Então as suas áreas de interesse são a pobreza de consumo, a pobreza multidimensional e as desigualdades. Então, hoje o título da sua intervenção vai ser Cabo Lutado, Cabo Apagado, Nighttime Lights and Multidimensional Poverty in Conflict-Torn Cabo Delgado. Giulia.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So Professor Arnfred took you to an invisible world, and I will take you now back to a visible one, though it is only visible from the sky. So this is the title of my presentation, and the structure is the following. First, I will present the context of the conflict in Cabo Delgado. Then I will proceed with the motivation and problem statement, research questions and methods, and then I will go on with results and conclusion. So as most of you know, Cabo Delgado is the northernmost province of Mozambique, bordering Tanzania. It is one of the poorest regions of Mozambique. In 2015, more than half of the population was multidimensionally poor, and 45% of the population was income poor. However, the region is extremely resource rich. Rubies, graphite, and timber have been part of the local economy for a very long time. And in 2010, a massive natural gas field was discovered off the coast of Cabo Delgado. However, the exploration and project of liquid natural gas extraction had to come to a halt in October 2017, when about 30 armed men attacked the 3 police stations in Mocimboa da Praia. Immediately, the local population recognized the attackers as local people and called them Al-Shabaab or Mashababos. They argued that these people wanted to establish Sharia rule and rejected the secular state, while also lamenting issues of corruption, social exclusion, and lack of economic opportunities in the region. The insurgency had a relatively low start with about 200 fatalities in the first year, but then violence erupted in 2020 with almost 2,000 fatalities. This is the situation updated to August 2022, and we have now had more than 1,300 organized political violence events, which led to more than 4,000 fatalities in Cabo Delgado only. Initially, these attacks were sporadic and consisted of assaults on towns and villages, as well as violence against civilians. However, it then evolved into more complex military operations, such as the occupation of entire town, which is what happened in Moçambique da Praia, but also in Palma. So the motivation to write such a study is that data collection is very risky or simply impossible in conflict-torn areas such as Cabo Delgado. However, tackling the population needs in terms, for example, of humanitarian assistance is fundamental and also helps in preventing that the insurgents ranks swell further. What this requires is a clear picture of the situation on the ground in terms especially of multidimensional well-being. Therefore, I turn to nighttime lights to estimate the impact of the conflict on multidimensional poverty. In particular, I first assessed the usefulness of nighttime lights data in conflict-torn areas, looking at the extent to which nighttime lights variation respond to violent conflict. And then second, I estimate the impact of violent conflict, proxied by nighttime lights, on multidimensional poverty incidents. In particular, I used 3 data sources. The first one is indeed nighttime lights, and I used 2 products. One is a monthly product, and the other one is an annual product. What this is simply satellite imagery, which is taken daily by satellites, and then it is aggregated into monthly composite or annual composites with an additional level of processing to clean the background and remove stray lights. The second data source consists of georeferenced data on political violence and protests occurred within Cabo Delgado from 2017 to 2020, and this is sorted from ACLED's Cabo Delgado website. And the last data source is the Multidimensional Poverty Index. Multidimensional poverty is based on deprivation in health, education, and living standards, and the one that I use is calculated for 2017, thus is based on the population and housing census of 2017. I have 4 specific research questions, and they are the following. The first one is, did nighttime lights change from 2017 to 2021 in areas affected by the conflict? And what is the trend in this variation? To answer these first 2 questions, I produce nighttime light maps, a rate of change of radiance, and a simple moving average of nighttime lights in the area. The third question is, how much did nighttime lights change in conflict-affected areas because of the conflict? And to tackle this more causal nexus, I propose a difference in difference design. And the last question is, how does the variation of nighttime lights in conflict area translates in terms of multidimensional poverty index? And I propose a fractional outcome regression between nighttime lights and multidimensional poverty index. So we now go into the results. I hope this is visible to some extent. So I present here 2 maps. The one on the left-hand side is the average radiance in Cabo Delgado in the first trimester of 2017, and the one on the right-hand side is the same for the first trimester of 2021. The circles that you can see in red are located 7.5 kilometers from each conflict event that occurred in Cabo Delgado that had more than 10 fatalities. So I do not know if it's visible, but it should seem that while on the first map there is still a level of, you can see white dots in some of the red circles, and those represent settlements and villages. For example, you can see one in the north, in Ngade, and all these lights that correspond to settlements most of them are gone in the first trimester of 2021. We can see here, yes, more detail, maybe this is clear. So we have Moçambique da Praia and Palma. These 2 towns have been key locations for the conflict. In Moçambique da Praia, we had the first violent event, and some of the leaders of the insurgency are actually from Moçambique da Praia. While Palma, when the attack on Palma occurred, this is when the conflict made international news, since lots of contractors and foreign workers were involved. So we can see in both maps that while on top is 2017 and then bottom is 2021, we can see that the nighttime radiance, so the illumination that occurred at night, is completely gone. The only thing that remains is on the right-hand side in Afungi Peninsula, that is Total Liquids Natural Gas Project, which is still illuminated in 2021, even though Total declared force majeure and then just handed the compound to the Mozambican military for safekeeping. So to sum up, answering the first question, we can say that nighttime lights does respond to violent conflict events, and that nighttime radiance is almost completely gone in areas affected by violent conflict. In the map that I show here, we can see the points in red. Those are the areas where nighttime lights decrease, and the points in the pixels colored in yellow are the areas where nighttime lights increased from 2017 to 2021. So we can see that, yes, in areas affected by conflict, the lights are gone, while in the rest of the province, on average, it remained pretty stable. So we move on to question number 3. How much did nighttime light change in conflict-affected areas because of the conflict? So as I said before, we look into a causal effect, so I propose a difference in difference design, and the main assumption of this design is a parallel trends assumption, which says that the time series of the outcomes in the two different groups, so in my case the group of pixels affected by the conflict and the group of the rest of the province of Cabo Delgado, these two groups follow a parallel trend, meaning that they differ by a fixed amount and show a common set of changes before the treatment. You can see here, I present in the graph, the lines in yellow, orange, and red are the pixels located around events with more than 10, more than 15, and more than 20 fatalities happened, and the line in gray is the rest of the province of Cabo Delgado, which is our control group. Come on. So we can see that this, indeed, they do have a parallel trend until before the onset of the conflict. So until October 2017, they are parallel, and this parallelism goes on until early 2019. And this corresponds to when the conflict actually became a lot more violent. So as we've seen before, until in the first 2 years, there were not as many fatalities occurred. But this changed in 2020. And with the increasing number of fatalities, we can also see that the radiance decreased sharply in areas affected by violent conflict events. So this is the empirical specification of my difference in difference model. And the coefficient of interest is on the right-hand side. So what we can see here is that in the three groups, so in the pixels with more than 10, 15, and 20 fatalities, nighttime lights decrease by 0.10 to 0.17 nanowatts per square centimeter per steradian. And that, interestingly, the reduction in nighttime lights is higher in those pixels that are located around events with a higher number of fatalities. We move on to the last question, and that was, how does the variation of nighttime lights in conflict-affected area translates in terms of multidimensional poverty index? So I propose a fractional regression logit model in which the dependent variable is the incidence of multidimensional poverty at the biolocalidade level in Cabo Delgado, and the independent variable is the mean of nighttime light radiance. This is calculated based on the census of 2017 and the nighttime radiance for 2017. I also control for provinces and for the degree of urbanization and median population density in each biolocalidade. So these are the results. The regression tells us that nighttime lights and multidimensional poverty are significantly associated, as we can see in this coefficient, and that this relationship is negative, is strongly negative. However, we cannot interpret the coefficient directly, so I look into the average marginal effect, and we can say from the model that an increase in 1 unit of average nighttime lights correspond to a decrease in the incidence of multidimensional poverty by 9.7 percentage points. Now, we have connected the two issues statistically, but it is also useful to connect them logically. So what are the channels that link conflict, proxied by nighttime lights, and multidimensional poverty? As I mentioned before, the multidimensional poverty index is made up of 3 dimensions, which are education, safe water and quality sanitation, and living standards. And the insurgency had a serious impact on these 3 dimensions, on all of them. In terms of education, the Machababos prohibited state-run schools in favor of madrasas ever since the onset of the conflict. And as the conflict proceeded, education was halted in more than 300 primary schools, and education was halted on all levels in 4 of the mostly affected districts in Cabo Delgado. In terms of safe water and quality sanitation, the insurgency destroyed a lot of the infrastructure, both public and private, and this arguably worsened access to safe water and sanitation. Also, a third of the health facilities in Cabo Delgado were shut down after the conflict, and most of them are no longer functional. In terms of living standards, there were multiple issues of looting of public and private infrastructure, and private houses were burned, property was destroyed and stolen, and this had a negative impact on the population's living standards. So to put this all together, we have seen with the difference in difference design that violent conflict causes a reduction in average nighttime light by minus 0.17 to minus 0.10 in the areas affected by the conflict. From the fractional outcome regression, we have seen that an increase in 1 unit of average nighttime lights corresponds to a decrease in the incidence of multidimensional poverty index by 9.7 percentage points. If we put this all together, we can say that violent conflict leads to an increase in the incidence of multidimensional poverty equal to 1.8 to 1.1 percentage point in the affected areas in Cabo Delgado. And what this means is that this model predicts that after the conflict, the incidence of multidimensional poverty in affected areas in Cabo Delgado is as high as 79%. So overall, with the study, I hope to have shown that nighttime lights data can support research in war-torn contexts and enable governments and humanitarian aid organizations to have a clearer picture of what is happening on the ground so that intervention can be more effective and efficient. In particular, in Cabo Delgado, multidimensional poverty has arguably increased after the conflict, and this is especially true for areas that suffered a higher number of fatalities. Of course, addressing all the new issues of multidimensional deprivation in Cabo Delgado is crucial, not only for preventing the insurgency from further developing, but also in order to tackle the underlying factors that enabled the insurgency itself.
Thank you very much. Ok, so já chegamos no fim das apresentações desse painel. Então convido os participantes, já vejo uma mão lá. Senhor, faz favor, pode colocar a pergunta. Favor de... o microfone. Se calhar as pessoas podem se introduzir antes de fazer a pergunta, se todo mundo sabe, quer dizer, todo mundo sabe quem é.
Bom dia, o meu nome é Fernando Lima, eu sou um jornalista. Primeira questão, e é para o Joe Hanlon, e eu não gostaria de deixar de intervir e saudar a coragem que o Joe Hanlon vem ao longo dos anos a colocar questões fraturantes e muito importantes na sociedade moçambicana, e por isso mesmo tem sido alvo de ataques ferozes das pessoas que não concordam com ele, nomeadamente nos órgãos de propaganda locais. Dito isto, eu tenho alguns problemas com esta narrativa do Joe Hanlon sobre estes these terrible evils that are attacking the Mozambican society. I would say IMF and the World Bank. I think that if you put all the attention on these two institutions, I think to a certain extent erases the level and the impact of social forces in Mozambique that move society to one direction, like, for example, capitalism. Do we have forces in Mozambique that are for market economy, capitalism, or are we just this kind of society of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Beau Sauvage, that here we are in this lovely country and all these guys from IMF and the World Bank came and are just destroying us and moving to a certain direction. So my question is, do you see an important level impact on local social and political forces that leads all these changes, or all is the guilt and the moves of World Bank and IMF. And in addition to that, at one point you said that liberation movements were forced to join or to get solidarity or support from Soviet Union and China. Are you convinced that there were no genuine Marxists, genuine revolutionaries in Angola, Mozambique, or Nicaragua that push for those changes, and these were just opportunistic changes that moved those people and those liberation movements towards Soviet Union and China? So was the Third Congress in 1977 that declares Frelimo a Marxist-Leninist party an opportunistic move of very superficial Marxist knowledge about what means a Marxist-Leninist party event, or was this more deep and more influenced by internal Mozambican forces that led to that creation? Finally, and in what turns the issue of Cabo Delgado, I notice you relate oil and gas and the changes in Afungi to the rebellion in Cabo Delgado. Do you acknowledge that in 2012, 2013, there were moves, ideological moves in that region, including in Ilha de Moçambique, contesting certain practices and based on a certain belief and concept how society should be organized and not forced by the whole issue of oil and gas. I have one small question for Signe. I noticed that you mentioned that the quest for modernism by Frelimo and colonial rule always put aside all the importance of traditionalism and the role of curandeiros and curandeiras. So how you can address the challenge of modernism and include also the traditional heritage of curandeiros and curandeiras without getting into some kind of disease in a Mozambican society today, which is everything that is modern is bad. What we should do is go into traditionalism, and if we get into the roots of traditionalism, we will find our ways to get a better society in Mozambique. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Vamos pegar mais umas duas, para ser 3 perguntas na mesa. Faça favor.
Bom dia, meu nome é Abdallah Moussa, sou um reformado. Eu sou de Cabo Delgado e todos os dias vivo Cabo Delgado. Agora tenho 67 anos, então eu vivi a Primeira Guerra de Libertação, vivi a Segunda Guerra dos 12 anos, dos quais participei. Eu estive envolvido 8 anos na guerra e agora estou nesta guerra. Cabo Delgado é a 4ª guerra, a começar pela Primeira Guerra Mundial. E, pelo que tenho acompanhado o pensamento dos investigadores, as análises eu acho que são feitas de uma forma muito isolada. Isola-se Moçambique da África. E as propostas que eu vejo para a solução, eu acho que não colam, porque este assunto do terrorismo, islamismo, começa desde a Nigéria, Mali, Burkina Faso, mas antes de tudo começou na Somália, e a Somália hoje já não é Estado. Vai até a Líbia, vai até o Iraque. Eu penso que devíamos fazer uma análise global, e eu digo que mesmo esta solução militar não resolve, porque se resolvesse a Nigéria tem um grande exército O Mali recebeu grande apoio da França e a guerra lá continua. Portanto, eu gostaria que sempre que analisássemos a situação de Cabo Delgado, que realmente coincide com a descoberta dos recursos, que já existem há muito tempo, mas também coincide com uma política de uma organização qualquer internacional que quer desorganizar. O terrorismo visa desorganizar. Toda a zona costeira de Cabo Delgado está desorganizada. E há um grande financiamento, mas nunca ninguém falou de quem financia, porque as armas não caem do céu, os salários que recebem não caem do céu, todo o equipamento sofisticado que tem não cai do céu. Para mim o cerne está é quem financia e quais são os interesses. E muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado pela pergunta. Então vamos pegar mais duas. Tem o Aslak e depois tem o senhor.
This is Aslak Orre from Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, Norway. So I have two quick questions, one for Giulia. When you look at the results on the nighttime lights, I wonder about the reasons why it goes down. So I would challenge you on the hypothesis of that. Would it be perhaps because the infrastructure producing light is destroyed because of the war? Or is it because people turn off the light to hide themselves from the rebels? Or do you think it's the influence of the rebel or the insurgents turning the lights off or forcing people to turn the lights off in order to hide? So the model doesn't really answer those questions, but I'd like to hear your hypothesis of it. Or is there any way the model can help you answer these questions? The other question is for Joe. And I was almost a little bit surprised you didn't address the questions of the hidden debts scandal and the dívidas ocultas. So I would like to hear your thoughts on where the hidden debts fit in your causal chain between the creation of the oligarchic model of capitalism in Mozambique and the war in northern Mozambique. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Aslak. Vamos dar ao senhor a oportunidade e depois já vi que há outros, então vamos dar uma segunda rodada.
Thank you. My question is for the nighttime light presentation. It's very similar. My question is, did you consider displacement in your nighttime lights measurement? And if you did, could you please elaborate? Thank you.
Obrigado. Então, vamos dar agora a oportunidade aos panelistas de responder. Peço ser um pouco breves, uns 3, 4 minutos cada, para depois dar tempo a mais. Vamos nessa ordem. Joe.
All right, very quickly to Lima. Remember that I only had 15 minutes, and you can't tell a book worth of story in 15 minutes. And what I'm trying to do is try to deal with agency and to deal with a whole set of influences which were largely ignored in the discourse up till now, because the discourse is very much internationally controlled. Now, one of the things that becomes really important of agency is that the period of the 1980s was an attempt for Mozambique to show agency and to follow its process of moving to a more marketized economy. Now, 1 million people got killed because Mozambique chose a socialist line. When Mozambique tried to do the step-by-step move to the market, the IMF came in and said no. And one of the power here against agency is Phyllis Pomerantz, who was the World Bank woman, in a meeting in the World Bank House in 1995, said, if you don't do what we tell you, we will cut off all aid to Mozambique and your people will starve. Now, at some point in this, you don't have agency, or your agency is very limited. And so it's partly remembering again, and of course, what's happening in Cabo Delgado is of course about greedy oligarchs and a greedy nomenclatura, but what the methods to stop that development were cut off by other forces. And so there's a lot of things going on. One other thing, I mean, Lima talks about 2010 along the Nampula coast. The point about the Nampula coast was that was exactly the era of the cholera riots. And as Carlos Serra showed, those were demonstrations against the elite. And that was showing the cholera was used as a way of attacking elites. And that was very important about agency of lower people, different people, poorer people. Aslak, please, 15 minutes doesn't even begin to talk about that. But the one thing to realize is that that comes into the oligarch period. And where does it come from? Credit Suisse, one of the biggest banks in the world, deal with the new oligarchs, Gubuza, to try to make deals to extract money from Mozambique. And so it fits with the model, but, you know, we have to think about a lot of other things too. But the point about agency is really important. And I think what I'm trying to do, and what I was trying to do in my brief talk, and probably a lot in the next book, is to say, yes, Mozambicans have agency, but there's been an awful lot of work done by the international community to restrict that agency over the last 30 years. Thank you.
Obrigado. Vamos para Signe, vamos seguir a ordem.
Yeah, okay, thank you for the question down there. It's a very good one. How can you challenge modernity without turning down tradition? How can you sort of build up modernity without turning down tradition? I think it depends on the way you do it. For Limo, some of you will remember their campaigns in the 80s, Abaixo Lobolo, Abaixo Ritas de Iniciação, Abaixo Poligamia. Frelimo was just out to eradicate the whole thing in order to do, it's not modernity or tradition. You have to turn tradition into modernity in different ways than what it was done in the capitalist Western society. And in order to do that, you have to listen and learn. You have to open your eyes and ears to what are in people's minds. And then, of course, I mean, making possible education is very, very important, because education can be used for all sorts of development, also of what people have in their minds. And I think we have seen now that the Western model does not work. It makes pollution, it makes polarization in society. It's very important to find alternative models of modernity. And I think there are resources in Mozambique for doing so, because of the North, because of the tradition in the North. And listen to the women is a very good thing. That's what I did myself. And I got lots of new ideas from listening to women. Just go there, listen to what people say, and build on that.
Thank you very much for your questions. So I'll start with the first one, which was, why does nighttime light decrease? And I consider that, unfortunately, with this type of data, we cannot with certainty distinguish when it is infrastructure and when it is private property. However, what I can argue is that I think that both would have an impact on the multidimensional poverty index, meaning that some of the dimensions of the MPI are dependent on, for example, public infrastructure, such as education and the health infrastructure. And what happens in Cabo Delgado is also that generators were not very common. So I think it was in 2020 when the Awase junction was taken. That was a point where a lot of the electricity that served the rest of the province passed through. This cut down electricity for a lot of people and also caused schools closures and health facilities closure, but also people were just not able to access light at night anymore. So I do think that that has an impact on multidimensional poverty regardless of which one it is. Interestingly enough, however, there are new product suits that are developing, and NASA is now launching the black marble, which that would allow a lot more precision, because they are the spatial resolution is, I think, 25,000 times more precise than the product that I have used. What I have used is a freely available product. I did this for my master thesis with no funding. So this was available for free, but there are other products available out there which would allow a lot more precision. But also that allows me to connect to the other question. So another possibility is simply that people have gone away, and this is why light is no longer there. So displacement is huge in Cabo Delgado still. I think we've almost reached 1 million of people. However, for example, when the Palma attack and occupation occurred, Palma has about 400,000 people, inhabitants. According to UNHCR, the number of refugees coming from the area right after the attack was about 100,000. So it is not the entire population that runs away, even after one of the most violent events and with the highest number of fatalities. Also, arguably, the people that ran away from the areas affected decreased their level of well-being, of multidimensional well-being. What happened in Cabo Delgado is that the level of management by the government and humanitarian aid organization was below expectations or below standards. I think more than 90% of the internally displaced people were still hosted by friends and family 2 years after the onset of the conflict. And still nowadays, most of them are not housed in government-provided facilities or aid-provided facilities, meaning that they have very little access to education, health, and decent living standards. I hope this answers both questions.
Boa tarde, obrigado. Eu chamo-me Armando Nhantumbo, sou jornalista. Minha pergunta vai para o Joseph. Da sua intervenção, fico com a ideia, corrija-me se estiver errado, de que a guerra de Cabo Delgado resulta, portanto, de uma má governação, de corrupção, portanto, de oligarquias, não é? Que foram criadas com o apoio do FMI por aí em diante. A minha pergunta é se esta é uma explicação única, é a única explicação que podemos dar ao conflito de Cabo Delgado. As pessoas que seguem este conflito, incluindo pesquisadores até, continuam a dizer que provavelmente haja outras variáveis, provavelmente precisamos ainda de estudar o conflito para percebê-lo. Já agora, recentemente, o Ministro da Defesa, claro que as palavras do Ministro da Defesa valem o que vale, representante de um governo, dizia que ainda não temos razões muito claras sobre este conflito. A forma como o Joseph coloca as questões é conclusiva ou não? Acha que há outras explicações? Havendo outras explicações, qual é o lugar dessas explicações se colocadas, portanto, na balança com esta linha que coloca das oligarquias, da corrupção e da governação? Obrigado.
Boa tarde, sou José Macuano da Universidade de Eduardo Mondlane. A minha questão, a primeira vai para o Joseph Hanlon. Eu gostava de ouvir alguma reflexão, espero que não seja uma extrapolação em relação a este crescimento do interesse em apoiar a solução do conflito por parte da União Europeia, okay? Dentro desta lógica também de ligação entre oligarquias nacionais e atores internacionais e também as dinâmicas de conflito existentes que bem explicou e também a relação com o crescente interesse em Moçambique como parte da solução da crise energética que vai ter implicações, sem dúvida, para as opções existentes para a Europa. Então, gostava de ouvir um pouco esta reflexão dentro do seu quadro analítico. Para a professora Signe, há um fenômeno que já foi descrito na região norte, que é a existência do banditismo como uma reação às estruturas matrilineares de parentesco, que nos últimos anos é um elemento que não tem sido muito analisado. Então, O meu ponto é se dos seus estudos, porventura chegou a encontrar este elemento como tendo alguma influência em algumas dinâmicas de violência existentes na região do Norte. Obrigado.
Sorry, thank you. My name is Teresa Cravo. I'm from the University of Coimbra in Portugal. I have a question for Joe Hanlon about the degree of recognition of mistakes, in your opinion. Because you finished your presentation basically stating that donors, such as the World Bank, have recognized that shock therapy was a problem. And I'm wondering if you think that's an actual questioning of the neoliberal paradigm or just sort of a light version in which more time and more institutionalization are needed, but there's actually no questioning of the core, which remains untouched. Or if you actually see any actual changes in policy which could signal a different approach. And for Signe Arnfred, I thought it was very interesting how you connected the history of Islam's sort of integration into cultural customs a long, long time ago, and how that gave women a greater leadership role, or adapted to women's greater leadership role in society. And I was wondering, in terms of the fundamentalist versions that we see today, if you see a path in which this sort of history could be rescued and women empowered to have a greater role in this current situation. Thank you.
Obrigado. Faça favor.
Bom, meu nome é N. Viegas, sou pesquisador do Centro de Estudos Estratégicos Internacionais aqui de Moçambique, e talvez por ser do Centro de Estudos Estratégicos Internacionais eu fico assustado quando se adotam conceitos sem se fazer um equilíbrio sobre esses conceitos. O primeiro conceito que me assusta é o conceito de oligarcas. É um conceito novo, está na moda, mas é easy to use, porque está na moda. Então estamos a transferir um conceito que está a passar por todos os jornais internacionais because of the Russian oligarchs, and we are having Mozambican oligarchs now. No, let's be honest and try to define concepts that are manageable, are sustainable, are useful for our situation. Not just bring up concepts that cannot be linked to our society. So please, do not be in the mood. Don't go in the mood. Don't go following trends. We cannot do it. Even the concept of nightlight time, come on, it is a weak methodology to follow. Very weak. There are many questions against it. Some of the people that are here have posed the questions, and you couldn't answer the questions right to support your ideas, because we are transferring concepts to our situation. O senhor ali de Cabo Delgado, não fiquei com o nome dele, fez uma posição muito clara. Let's bring a hierarchy. Vamos lá fazer as hierarquias de causas e efeitos. O que está por cima e o que está por baixo. Para nós estabelecermos os strong links and the weakest links. So, quando nós chegamos aqui e encontramos um painel que faz uma análise based on the weakest links, doesn't work. Why don't we bring up the strong links and then we can go downstairs? Do not put the weakest links above all other things. And then, sabe o que acontece depois? Diz, não, ele é do Centro de Estudos Estratégicos, está a criticar porque há uma crítica contra o governo. Não! It doesn't work like that for me. It is because your tools are not answering the questions. Your tools are very weak. Bring us some tools that are very strong, that cannot be questioned, and then I will say, yes, this is fantastic. I will follow you. By the way, I follow Hanlon publications every day. Useful, very strong, very precise. I love your publication. But today, I don't think the concept of oligarchs is useful for this situation. Sorry for being just confrontational.
Vou me apresentar de princípio. Farouk Ibrahim, sou pesquisador E também sou de Cabo Delgado, nasci lá, conheço Cabo Delgado muito bem e tenho formações portanto, em Sharia, portanto, em direito islâmico, conheço o que é isto de Sharia. Portanto, gostaria mesmo de abordar em torno daquilo que estava abordando em torno dela a Giulia. Trouxe-nos aqui uma exposição como que a questão da pobreza vai aumentar depois desta questão do conflito. Mas eu gostaria mesmo de aproveitar o ensejo, a presença aqui de várias organizações internacionais não governamentais, para dizermos que eu sou de Cabo Delgado, temos nos ressentido com esta questão do conflito. Agora já o conflito está tomando outras dimensões, portanto já faz-se sentir, portanto, saindo da zona norte da província para a zona sul, até já chegando à província de Nampula. Isto está nos desgastar. E muito daquilo que a gente tem acompanhado das ONGs é sempre, portanto, uma intervenção de desenvolvimento. Vamos criar programas de desenvolvimento, vamos criar postos, vamos criar emprego, vamos criar isto e aquilo. Tudo bem, isto vai fazer com que os jovens não se alinhem com o grupo dos insurgentes. Mas o que é que tem se feito para que aqueles jovens que estão já na fila dos insurgentes retirem-se?
Pode colocar uma pergunta alguém?
Só para terminar a minha reflexão. Eu conheço, portanto, o que acontece em outros países, na Burkina Faso, na Nigéria, como dizia o engenheiro Abdallah Moussa, na Nigéria, em Mali, já tem pautado pelo diálogo. Eu acho que também seriam o mesmo que as ONGs podiam dar como seu contributo neste país. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado. Então vamos dar a oportunidade de responder. Eu estava a dizer só, antes de ser interrompido, que uma questão posta na mesa por vários foi essa questão de múltiplas causas e de não tiver um monocausalismo na explicação do conflito, que acho que é uma questão importante e, vamos dizer, foi levantada por vários, mas peço aos intervenientes de falar alguns minutos. Acho que temos mais 15 minutos ou por aí, então se tivermos sorte, mais umas ou duas perguntas. Joe.
Okay. I think that's the main point, that civil wars do not have a single cause. And all of the studies of civil wars show multiple causes, multiple influences, and also the shapes of these wars change over time. And no two civil wars are the same. So what we have to realize is that you look at the Mozambique, the Cabo Delgado Civil War now. It presented itself in 2017, but even before that, 2015, 2013, as an intra-Islamic conflict. It was between a younger generation of Quranist preachers who were challenging a Wahhabi, Frelimo-linked, southern-based Islam. Now, and they presented it as intra-Islam. Now, this transformed itself into a different kind of war. And it transformed itself into a different kind of war, in part because of outside influences, in part because of local grievances. So we should be careful about, saying, that there is only one explanation. But what is important is that if we look at civil wars in general, there are two things that are true about all civil wars. There are always outside influences, and there is always a grievance serious enough that people are prepared to kill their neighbors. And often it's because they feel they are defending themselves against what they feel is a threat to their family. Now, what we also know about civil wars in general is that civil wars are never resolved without resolving the underlying grievance. And we had a talk, the opening talk was very much about why was the Renamo War of the 1980s never really resolved. And that was because the grievances that were behind it were never resolved. And the fact that it was a proxy war, it was pushed by the US and the South Africans, doesn't mean that there wasn't a grievance there as well. And that was never resolved. Now we have the same problem in Cabo Delgado. We have a grievance which is very strong, which is strong enough that thousands of young people are prepared to go to war. And that's lack of jobs, lack of gains from the resources, and Islamic State is trying to build on those grievances, and that's why they can recruit people. Now, I come from England, and we had the war in the north of Ireland, and which was allegedly between Catholics and Protestants, Christians. But those were flags, and those were flags about identifying people who had grievances about jobs, about other things. And the Good Friday Agreement came about when the British government realized it had to resolve the grievance, and then you could negotiate a peace. The problem we're in now in Cabo Delgado is that we're refusing to understand that there is a grievance, whatever shape, whatever place it has, and we will never end the war in Cabo Delgado without resolving the grievance. And of course we can blame all sorts of other people, but that is the problem. Now, small question over on the side, is the World Bank recantation real or not? Remember that the World Bank and the IMF are large institutions, and there are pockets in both that are more progressive. And what's interesting is the amount of good research that is produced within the World Bank, particularly. But nobody pays attention to it, because if it doesn't fit the ideology, the decisions that are taken ignore the good research. And so that's the problem. I mean, there are researchers in the World Bank who recognize the problem, but at the top, the policies remain the same. And the policies are the ones that are driving the grievance. So we're caught in a pocket that if we don't recognize the grievance and we don't resolve the grievance, which is basically about creating jobs. And I noticed the two USAID people have left, but I come from the US originally. And in the 1930s in the US, Franklin Roosevelt created something called the Works Progress Administration in the Depression, in which they put to work 100,000 people. Huge program. That couldn't be done now because Franklin Roosevelt is now treated as having been socialist. And so we don't do that sort of thing anymore, and yet that's exactly what we need in Cabo Delgado. If you did a project like that in Cabo Delgado, the war would stop because there wouldn't be anybody to fight. They'd all have jobs. And we have to think about, whatever we think the package is of how this came about, the one piece of history that we know is that no civil war is ever resolved without resolving the grievance.
I had two questions for me, and I have the feeling that both questions were very good, and I want to answer, but I didn't really get the point of any of them, but I think good questions are always very good, but I just want you just in one sentence to say I want to comment on it, but I didn't really guess. You understand when I speak in English? Yeah, okay. I didn't pick up your Portuguese well enough, I'm sorry.
My question is that there are studies showing that in the northern region, there has been a phenomenon of banditism, which is a reaction to the matrilineal kinship system. So my question was whether you have come across this kind of phenomena in your studies in the northern region as part of the explanation of the dynamics of violence in the northern region.
No, I don't think the way you put it, I don't think. I mean, I have met, one thing is important here, I think, that my field studies were done long before this conflict started. So I'm just sort of, my it's a background for understanding what is going on. I wasn't aware of, or there was no conflict when I was doing it. Of course, there are issues with matrilineal because the young men did not like it. They had to go through their mothers-in-law. They felt supervised, and they welcomed market economy. They welcomed wage work, and they were supported by Frelimo. So the women lost out, of course, I mean, there's no black and white here, and there are conflicts in the matrilineal societies. What I want to talk about is that it's not that the men did not have power, but they had it through the women. We are so used in the Western world that women have power through men. I mean, so I think we just have to widen the spectrum of how you can think about humanity, but of course, it's not without troubles. I had the similar question, even if you spoke in English, didn't get, there was something about fundamentalism. You?
Yeah, it was just about the history of the less fundamentalist version of Islam that was ingrained in the beginning of the century that you mentioned. And the question was about, given the more fundamentalist versions that we see today, whether there is, if you see a path of rescuing that other version and how that could empower women again in this current situation.
Yeah, well, of course, I think I'm prepared to see this. I grew very fond of this matrilineal mix with Islam that I found along the coast, and particularly in Ilha de Moçambique, where I studied, but I have a feeling it's also in Angos. Angos is really a rich field, which I didn't go deep into when I made these studies. The reason of course, it is a small current within Islam, but it also has there are things called Islamic feminism now. There are things also moving within the Islamic body, so it would be nice if there could be a connection, and this is also where I think that sometimes it makes sense to go to and fro in history, and to find resources in the past. But this Islamic feminism I haven't met in Mozambique. It's only been working with Islam on a broader scale as a gender scholar. But I think there are inspiration to find in the coastal areas of northern Mozambique.
Yes, I think there was also a question about the poverty conflict nexus. I am not entirely sure I understood everything of it. But I think, yes, so that there is, I think, undeniably a connection between poverty and conflict. Now, this relationship is definitely a very complex one and not unilinear. I think there are indeed two directions of causality in there. What I did in my study was to look only at one of them, and this is not the causes of the conflict. Rather, I looked at how conflict leads to an increase in poverty. And I think that is undeniable. While on the first side of the relationship, which Professor Hanlon addressed now, multiple causes intervene and multiple causes happen at the same time and can lead to a conflict, and that is something that might be more difficult to define with certainty which cause has the leading part. In terms of the impact of conflict on poverty, then we can be a little more certain in saying that some impact will be there. It is a matter of estimating how much it is, but I think it is undeniable that in a conflict such as this one, which has such a high level of destruction and violence, there will be some impact on multidimensional well-being.
Obrigado. Estamos quase no fim do tempo que foi nos alotado. Eu não sei se tem uma ou duas últimas perguntas rápidas. Estou a ver uma mão aqui, pode dar o microfone, temos 5 minutos, então, e outra mão aqui. Uma e duas, e vamos parar por aí. Peço que as perguntas sejam concisas, por favor.
Sim, muito boa tarde. Aqui fala Belchor Eduardo. Bom, as questões que antes quis colocar já foram colocadas, mas há palavras que ouvi com o professor Hanlon está a referenciar mais a questão da guerra civil. Podemos considerar o conflito em Cabo Delgado uma guerra civil, tomando em consideração a composição dos grupos terroristas? E E também a segunda questão que quero colocar é que será que já pensamos que os mesmos locais afetados pelos conflitos armados, os mesmos locais afetados pelos conflitos armados hoje são os mesmos que foram afetados na guerra civil? Não sei se já paramos para pensar na guerra civil e na guerra de libertação. Esse tipo de coincidência é uma coincidência meramente simplista ou existe algo ligado? Então, e mais uma que é importante destacar que mesmo em Nampula, os locais onde os terroristas fizeram as suas incursões, esses locais foram afetados também por esses dois conflitos. Há uma coincidência, esse tipo de coincidência. Eu sugiro que as nossas pesquisas devem passar a serem olhadas num outro prisma. As causas, as supostas causas hoje referenciadas em várias pesquisas, é necessário que estas causas sejam repensadas, revistas, para que se possam de verdade trazer as reais causas desse conflito. Então não vou me alongar porque as outras questões já foram lançadas. Obrigado.
Obrigado. Então, a última intervenção aqui.
Sim, muito obrigado. Eu sou Lati de Almeida. Em termos de perguntas, em tanto quanto diretas, já fui ultrapassado com as várias intervenções aqui, mas tenho dois pequenos comentários. O primeiro comentário vai para o investigador Joseph Hanlon. Tem a ver com a lógica do financiamento ou da lógica da adoção de políticas das instituições do Banco Mundial e do FMI. Não só em Moçambique, como em os outros países e da África, que no meu entender têm sido mais paliativas e de resolução imediata de um determinado assunto naquele momento e não necessariamente a longo prazo. Porque as políticas desenvolvimentistas do FMI, no contexto dos países em desenvolvimento, praticamente nunca se viu numa situação em sair-se do subdesenvolvimento e um desenvolvimento acrescido, com todo tipo de investimento, com todo tipo de políticas que aqui têm sido adotadas. O outro assunto é verificar a posição ou a lógica retórica do Ocidente com a questão do conflito de Cabo Delgado. Se formos a recordar, uma das primeiras medidas que o Estado moçambicano tomou quando eclodiu aquele conflito foi a contratação de uma firma de uma firma russa para estancar o conflito. O que é que aconteceu? É que os russos saíram praticamente derrotados ou infelizes naquele conflito. Apresento este argumento por quê? Porque, misteriosamente, quando entende-se que as tropas ruandesas tinham que vir a Moçambique, o terrorismo praticamente abrandou. E há uma ligação direta entre a empresa francesa que está a explorar o gás em Cabo Delgado e o Ruanda do presidente Paolo Kagame. Então é muito difícil de compreender estas dinâmicas. Ocidente, Oriente. Os conflitos e a lógica da sua evolução ou do seu abrandamento. Recentemente estivemos, acho que foi na semana passada, a União Europeia doou a Moçambique material não bélico para o combate ao terrorismo. É difícil compreender isso, num contexto em que vidas e vidas humanas. Um dos sinais de Jandir apresentou, já estamos em quase 5 mil mortos. 5 mil mortos, então há uma ajuda que é material e não bélico. Eu não sei se é material não bélico, num contexto em que as pessoas estão a ser decapitadas, estão a ser violadas, estão a ser escravizadas e tudo mais, isto pode melhorar. O outro comentário é para Giulia, espero estar a dizer bem o nome, e é muito breve. Há uma tendência de associar o Islão ao terrorismo. Eu vejo que não há conexão possível. O Islão, a religião muçulmana, é uma religião de paz. Então, o que acontece na África Ocidental, na África Central, em outros países onde há aquilo que se chamou aqui de maldição dos recursos, é justamente o que está acontecendo em Cabo Delgado. Usar a capa religiosa para perpetrar aquilo não se difere de crimes. E crimes puníveis a nível interno e a nível das convenções internacionais. Então não há a lógica possível aí. O outro assunto é dizermos que, ok, os jovens, os menos favorecidos estão a ser recrutados por causa da pobreza e por causa das políticas desenvolvimentistas do governo que estão a falhar. Mas eu pergunto, em qual das províncias que não há vulnerabilidade? Em quais da província e deste país que não haja vulnerabilidade dos jovens e uma pobreza acentuada? Dois simples exemplos, o interior de Gaza e o interior de Tete. Acredito eu que há mais pobreza do que naquelas províncias lá do norte de Cabo Delgado, porque ali pelo menos tens a pesca e tens a agricultura. Então não se pode levar de ânimo leve e concluir-se que é por causa da pobreza e falta de oportunidades que há aquele tipo de conflitos. E, por fim, o moderador já está a dar-me sinal, é uma crítica ao governo por causa da reação tardia. Em 5 de outubro de 2017, quando houve o primeiro ataque em Moçambique da Praia, veio, infelizmente, o comandante-geral da polícia a chamar os que atacaram de meus bandidos e ainda mais. Dá 7 dias para que os mesmos tinham que se entregar. Isto, sinceramente, é muito perigoso, é levar de ânimo leve. E ainda mais, o conflito foi se alastrando até o centro e o norte de Cabo Delgado praticamente não se viver. Muidumbe, Moçambique da Praia foram praticamente tomadas. O Ruanda indicou que são 1.000 homens. Estou a usar os dados oficiais que foram indicados. 1.000 homens. Com todo o nosso exército, das suas várias especialidades, foram só com 1.000 homens que nós conseguimos recuperar Moçambique da Praia, recuperar Muidumbe e estancar as bases mais perigosas dos terroristas. E, por fim, está agora em Memba. Há um perigo aí. O governo e todos os atores interessados em terminar o terrorismo têm. Memba é um dos santuários mais radicalizados do Islão na província de Nampula. Depois de Memba, se não estivermos atentos...
Podemos concluir?
A ilha fica em risco, o Angosto fica em risco e vai vulnerabilizar Pebani na província da Zambésia. Então eu vejo que há nuances que não são trazidas nem com investigadores, nem com as unidades, nem com as entidades estatais. Mas por todo esse esforço que foram feitos, e muito obrigado e desculpa por ter me alongado.
Muito obrigado, foi uma intervenção muito importante. Embora Muidumbe não está recuperado ainda, mas pronto. Acho que tem 2 perguntas na mesa. Eu queria só, pôr um pouco de piripiri na pergunta sobre a guerra civil. Ou não piripiri, mas de fato há alguns que trabalham com esse conceito de novas guerras, New War. Acho que a pergunta, de fato, eu estava a pensar a mesma coisa. A lição sobre guerras civis que nos traz é muito importante, mas será que não há, de fato, essas novas guerras que depois cronicizam-se, que não tem algo na concepção de guerra que está a mudar hoje? Enquanto também as concepções de soberania, as concepções da nação, etc., mudam. A outra segunda questão era para a Giulia também. Queria pôr lá algo também para pensar. Em Cabo Delgado a energia chegou muito tarde. Eu estive lá na altura em que não havia em toda a província. Caborabassa, o colega de Cabo Delgado pode me recordar, mas que chegou em 2006 ou 2007, antes estava. Mas acho que ficou mais pobre quando chegou a energia do que antes. As pessoas viviam melhor, certamente, do que hoje. Então, só para complicar essa questão de relação entre energia e pobreza. Desculpa ter falado mais um minuto. Acho que são o Joe e a Giulia, mas também se a Signe quiser dizer algo. Não, ok. 1 minute each or 2 minutes each, and then we close.
Okay. I want to say 3 things. I'll come back to the civil wars. But the first thing is that what I would argue is happening globally post-Cold War is recolonization. And recolonization does not look like the previous empires. This is not the 19th century. But the agencies of recolonization are the World Bank and the IMF. And these are the agencies which are doing the same colonial extraction which was done in the 19th century. And it's often done in the same divide and rule things which were done in India and in other places in the 19th century. So we're seeing a recolonization with a slightly different shape. And I think it's actually important to look at terrorism. Terrorism is the weapon of the weak to show that they have power. And those of us who are old enough to remember the Renamo War, with Renamo did amazing things. They would stop a bus on the N1 in Três de Fevereiro village and let some people off and then set fire to the bus with people inside and say, go and tell people, this is so you can tell people what we do. And the terrorists from Renamo were in Parliament. And some of the worst terrorists of Renamo were members of Parliament, head of parliamentary commissions. We settled with them. We talked to terrorists. In the end of the day, you have to talk to terrorists because that is the weapon of the weak. And you look at the fighters in Cabo Delgado, they're farm boys. The only tool they have is a machete. You know, you look at these groups that are going into villages in Cabo Delgado, and it's 10 people with 2 guns, and everybody else has got a machete. And so you use the machete. What are you going to do? And okay, it is to frighten people. Of course it's to frighten people. That's what terrorism is about. But we have to talk to terrorists. We have no choice. You have to talk to terrorists. And we have to accept that that's the weapon of an insurgent movement very often. So, you know, I don't like it. And I definitely didn't like the Renamo terrorists in Parliament. And I had to interview them as a journalist. But you bite your tongue and you do it. Because that was how peace was resolved. Now,
1 minute.
All right, new wars. There was a fashion after the end of the Cold War of that wars had different shapes. And what is interesting, if we look at the current set of wars, they're the old wars. They are exactly the old civil wars that we were having before. The nature of civil war has not changed. We may try to give it other labels, but it hasn't changed. It looks the same. And this is true across the world. And this is a kind of civil war that was accelerated by this recolonization process. And a lot of it is reaction to this recolonization process. And so we're seeing the wars of decolonization beginning to take place again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Giulia, 1 minuto.
I think we have talked extensively about the different intervening causes in the conflict, so I would not leave too much time to that. But I will take up the provocation given on what happened when electricity got to Cabo Delgado, and maybe the province is poorer now than it was before. Of course, that depends on how we define poverty, and I do not think that the multidimensional poverty index is where poverty finishes or ends. There are multiple dimensions that intervene in human fulfillment that are just not listed there. And of course, I do agree. In the multidimensional poverty index, access to electricity is considered, so that is one part. Multiple other parts are simply not there. So that is just based on our definition of poverty, and I think multiple exist and multiple can be correct in different contexts. This one was the one that I have looked for this specific task.
Muito obrigado. Já chegamos no fim desse painel. Resta-me agradecer muito os contribuintes, agradecer as perguntas. Eu peço uma salva de palmas para os contribuintes e as pessoas que fizeram perguntas. Obrigado.